one. As of now, we are recording live, and just want to say, ever since I've been starting doing this podcast, I'm my best friend. We've been doing it for over a year now. We've had plenty of guests on. Mackenzie, I just want to say two things. You are the first guest now that we've had on twice, and also, if you look back at all of our guests we've had in the top 5 episodes of all time, you are number 3 in terms of our top ever episodes done. And I just want to say welcome back, man.
Mate, that's some awesome stuff. That I'm so honored to be asked to join you on your podcast. That's really cool.
Yeah, I'm happy that you're happy, because when we did our first episode, which I believe was back in February, that was one of the few episodes where I walked away learning a whole bunch of stuff. And then when I actually put it on my gym page, put it on my personal page and personal Instagram, a lot of people actually contacted me and said, wow, I actually learned a lot from that podcast. And also, you got to say, man, especially following you in terms of social media as well, you got a whole bunch of knowledge, man, based around nutrition. And I was just going to say, man, how long have you been studying nutrition for now since the last time we talked?
Firstly, man, that's some really fantastic feedback. I really do appreciate it. So, I mean, in terms of how long I've been studying nutrition, it really depends on what you define as study. Formally, it's probably been 3 years of continuous study. However, I've now been doing my master's, which obviously is the highest level of academia that I've been, I guess, studying or involved in. I'm now sort of halfway through that, and working full time means that I'm doing the master's part time. So it takes me a little bit longer than your usual master's. So it is a research based master's. So I have a big thesis coming up. But yeah, it's been, my interest in nutrition, ever since I started learning about nutrition, has probably been a 6-year thing. But the thing worth noting is that there are definitely many, many folks out there who know so much more than me. It's not funny. And this whole idea of the Dunning-Kruger thing, where you first start to learn a little bit about a topic and all of a sudden you think you're a guru, then realize you get that big slap in the face and realize that you know nothing. And then slowly you build back up there. That is definitely a real deal. However, if I was to toot my own horn for a second, I actually feel like it's my lack of academic intelligence compared to the other folks, doing masters or PhDs and things like that in nutrition, that gives me somewhat of a point of difference, because, I'm not an academic person, but here I am doing things that would be defined as academic. And what it basically forces me to do is to be able to translate messages into something that I can understand and I can relate to. And that could involve things like certain frameworks or analogies, but I can then sort of communicate this to other people, because when you're an academic and you don't have the ability to just talk to everyday folks, you're probably not helping that many people. You might be moving I guess the scientific literature forwards and benefiting society in that way. But I feel the shortcoming is then translating that into messages and practical messages that people, in the just sort of everyday folks, if we want to call it that, that they can actually understand and grasp and be able to apply to their own life and their own diets.
100%. Oh, that makes sense, because what you spoke about earlier, I mean, one of the reasons why I believe that you actually put everything so good at putting stuff out there, and again, I feel 100% the same with you, because especially myself as a PT, there's so many other PTs out there that know so much more. And then when you're constantly around people who know so much more, you can be quite humbling in a way, because then there's something very important that someone told me, that a fool believes himself to be an intelligent man, but an intelligent man thinks of himself as a fool, because it goes down to the idea, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons why I've always been following you is just the way that you present your content is in such bite-sized chunks. Now, in the world of research, it can be, in my experience, times tedious, going through hours and hours of long research and papers and reading constant references and, constantly trying to break everything down. To get the information for you, as you put it, in almost bite-sized chunks, like you can do in your social media posts, where it's just 4 slides and you just explain the study explain the purpose, explain the results, give your own personal knowledge. You can read that in the space of a couple of minutes, and then you've learned something. And I feel like that's where we're going right now in terms of nutrition and training, especially in things like reels. People are explaining exercises, recipes, nutrition in the space of like up to 10 seconds or less. So obviously, everyone, it's important to be reading the big stuff, like, the long hours and hours of reading. And obviously that's how you get, certificates and degrees. But for people who are not interested in getting a master's degree or not interested in getting a bachelor's or certificate, they just want to read that sort of stuff and then just almost get better in a sort of upskill themselves in a way. And that brings me to where we are now. Recently, we had a discussion before I invited you back on the podcast where I had someone, I'll give you some context. So someone came to me and someone was telling me about this new supplement line. And then they were saying to me, what is it? They saying that this is new supplement line that they believe to replacing whole foods. Now, personally, when I saw that myself, I was like, okay, so this is why we hate influencers so much. But I'm sure then there's a way to break it down. But then straight away, within like 20 minutes of having that conversation, you put up the post on social media saying so-called wellness experts advising social media audience that whole foods is not needed with their new supplement line. Now, someone from your expertise and someone from your perspective, explain to me the context and why this is in fact false.
Yeah, so when it comes to supplements, supplements can be highly beneficial all the way through to completely pointless, then all the way through to detrimental. And I think it's the potential for a supplement to be detrimental, which people aren't aware to, like those avenues by which they can actually harm someone. People think of supplements as like, okay, well, it might, a lot of people know that or have the understanding that the supplement in question probably doesn't do anything. I think that's sort of my assumption, is that that's the general approach from people. But often they then think, well, what's the harm in trying? It's a bit of money, but what's the harm in trying? Well, actually, there are reasons why we shouldn't just take supplements because it might work. It's not a risk-free thing. So really, the deal with supplements is that on the continuum, or I guess the scale of order of importance. So if we want to improve our body or improve our health or change our bodies rather, or do anything like that, there are certain factors that sort of lie on a continuum. And we should not really be worrying about the thing further up the scale unless we're nailing that more important, more pivotal, and more influential factor first. So the more influential factors would be, general diet quality. Is the diet whole food focused? Are we controlling calories to some degree in some manner, whether it be objectively, numerically, or just, via habits and things like that? So they're sort of, generally speaking, depending on the goal, but more specifically for weight management health, like the big rocks. And then supplements are like the very tip of the iceberg, or like the icing on the cake. Whereas it's sort of like having a car and saying, I'm going to worry about what rims it's got when you don't even have your driver's license. It's like, okay, if we want to learn how to drive a car and be able to drive, to the beach on the weekend, we should probably worry about getting our license first before we worry about what rims we put on our car, right? So, that's not to say that supplements don't have their place, because in some instances, every top 1%er is worth it. But, unless you're nailing those big rocks first, you don't have a place, really talking about things like supplements. However, there is some nuance to that, because in some instances, supplements might be quite important. So for example, if someone is deficient in iron, having taking supplemental iron could really be, quote unquote, a game changer for that person. So there are different situations where that would not be, where supplements would be quite important. So really, we would take supplements to address a shortcoming of our diet. And even if that's for convenience reasons. So, we would take a protein powder, sure, we can eat protein powder through food, but sometimes, we don't want to have, a chicken breast on the side of our oats. We want to just mix some delicious chocolate protein powder into our oats. So it can be for a convenience or like a preference perspective. Okay, that would be a sound reason to have a supplement. The other one would be to address like something that the diet doesn't provide us with. So for example, again, if the individual was iron deficient, they weren't getting enough iron through their diet, then supplementing with iron would be appropriate. However, almost always, we don't want to just take a supplement because we think we might be deficient in it or we think we need more, because more does not necessarily equal better. And I'll get to that in a second. But the other reason is that, unless we have actually been diagnosed with a deficiency, you are iron deficient, then it's not a good idea to just take a supplement because there are risks involved in doing that. So unless there is a reward for doing it, then it's not worth taking, exposing yourself to a risk factor. So back to what I was saying before, what are the risks? What are the negatives of taking a supplement just because? So there are numerous risks. For athletes competing in tested sports, well, often supplements might contain a banned substance. And this might be completely by accident or through cross-contamination. We can do things like, only by batch tested supplements that have been independently tested for purity, but still there is always an inherent risk factor. The other reason, and this is more speaking towards sort of your everyday folks, is that there is this idea of the food matrix, where certain components of foods and nutrients and vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients, and all these little things, they are all present in foods to form a matrix. So they all are present in certain ratios and in certain combinations that basically enhance their effect once ingested. Okay, so sometimes when we ingest a really high dose of one particular nutrient, it might affect that balance because we don't have that food matrix or that synergistic effect going on. So different nutrients they work synergistically. Okay, so for example, if we ingest a large amount of I think it's iron, then sometimes it might affect our calcium absorption. I might be wrong with the combination of it. My memory is just really off the mark right now. But what I'm saying is that if you ingest very high doses of one particular thing, it might affect the efficacy or the efficiency or the effectiveness of the actions of other nutrients or other components of that food, or it could actually even affect the absorption of other nutrients that compete for the same absorption pathways, which then may even cause a deficiency in something else. Okay. And the other thing, of course, is that it costs a lot of money, and we need to remember that taking supplements is an expensive thing, and our financial health is a part of our total health. Health is more than just our weight or our body fat percentage or our blood work. It also encompasses our social health and things like our financial health too. So that's something that we need to consider. The other thing, we can develop like an unhealthy dependence on, if we don't take our supplements, like we're bad, or we're doing something wrong, or we're failing with our diet, sort of objectives. And that can be a negative thing psychologically, because it creates dichotomous thinking where, you are good or bad, or you are on or off a bandwagon, which has been linked with, body image concern and eating pathology, so disordered eating and things like that. I think I've covered everything. Yeah. And the final one is that it can actually distract us from the things that matter. We can get so fixated on the latest supplement and whether we take it and which product to buy that we kind of completely miss the forest for the trees. Whereas we should be focusing on things like, hey, are we, eating enough vegetables? And in terms of magnitude of effect or level of influence on the outcome that you desire, something like eating enough fruits and vegetables is far more important and meaningful. And we don't have any place, as I said before, worrying about supplements until we're nailing those big rocks first. So long story short, supplements can be anything from a small help to pretty helpful, but most of the time, 95% of the time, they're not. If we think of the supplements out there that actually have enough evidence behind them to say that, hey, they work, it's like a tiny amount of supplements. And unless we're talking about correcting a deficiency or something of that nature, usually in the supplements that we know work, the actual magnitude of benefit is very small and not always shown in every one. So there are supposed people who don't respond to creatine. There are also people who don't do well on caffeine. So all because a supplement has solid evidence behind it doesn't mean that like it's really going to do much. It might help a little bit, and doesn't mean that it's going to help you as an individual.
That makes sense. There was a lot of fair points that you put. There are a lot of points you just got across just right then. There was one that just really stood out to me of what you just said, where if you take, sorry if I'm repeating this incorrectly, but if you take so much of something, then it affects the way that other mechanisms create nutrients. Was that correct?
Semi. So this is this idea of like the food matrix, where different components of a food that are, you know, present in their natural form, they work synergistically to have like an overall enhanced positive effect. Whereas if you don't have that balance of various food components, you're not going to get the benefits of that synergistic effect. And therefore you're going to be getting less out of that nutrient or other nutrients.
Okay. So the reason why I wanted you to repeat that and sort of get that out is because you kind of answered my second question in advance, where, again, we can clear up a little bit more. I wanted to ask you about the post you put up recently about vitamin C and about why you believe it to be pointless. Now, the reason why when I looked at that and read it, I was like, oh, that's interesting. Because for me personally, I am someone who, I can share this opinion with a lot of people, hates getting sick with a passion. It is like the worst feeling in the world. And me growing up personally, I was always taught to believe, if you get a flu or a cold, and again, this is knowledge that I had to throw away, that, it could be because you're lacking in vitamin C. And I always thought that vitamin C was something that you need to take in order to keep away things like, the cold or the bug or the virus. So when I thought, obviously when this COVID was going around, I thought, everyone was going to be hopping on the vitamins wagon, especially taking vitamin C. And also, can you explain why, in short, why it is that vitamins C is pretty much, it's almost like you said, taking it is pointless?
Yeah. So look, if you are deficient in something, like you literally, don't have enough of something going around or coming in, like a certain vitamin, getting those levels up to an adequate range will have a notable difference on its respective mechanisms of action. And one of those for vitamin C being, it plays a role in, it's an antioxidant, so it plays a role in immunity and that sort of side of things. So if you are deficient and you increase your vitamin C to an adequate amount via food or supplements, that's going to be worthwhile. That's definitely a good idea, right? However, going beyond an adequate amount isn't necessarily better. And there are numerous reasons for that. But before I get to that, I'll actually explain that, or you must understand, or the listeners must understand, that meeting an adequate amount of vitamin C, like achieving enough to be adequate or, good with vitamin C, quote unquote good, is very, very easy. From memory, even just one kiwi fruit doubles the recommended daily intake of vitamin C for adult Australians. So, think about if we just eat general fruits and veggies, especially if we are meeting the Australian Dietary Guidelines recommendations for fruit and veggies, which is about 300 grams of fruit a day, 2 serves, or 5 servings of vegetables, which is about 400 grams a day. We should have no issue at least just meeting vitamin C adequacy. It's a very easy nutrient to meet an adequate amount of. Now, as I said, more is not better. There is no real evidence to suggest that having more than the adequate amount is going to give you better of anything. If you have a cold and you sort of really slam vitamin C in a very high dose, it may help there. If you were in competition and you wanted to, maximize your preparedness for, the next day, like if it's a multi-day competition or, like I think back to my own experience when I used to race mountain bikes, like it would be a 3-day sort of thing and I'd be really sore each day. So in those instances, it might be, worthwhile taking vitamin C during that time to try and, mitigate that soreness for the next day. So I could be more prepared to perform my best, for example, right? But in any other situation, like you're not going to get anything more out of extra vitamin C. It's not really going to stop you from getting sick. It's not really going to, get you better quicker, like a marginal difference. But there are also some trade-offs to actually consider. And, if you are someone who trains or exercises to either be stronger, to be more jacked, or to be more fatigue resistant in an endurance setting. So you're like an endurance exerciser. When we exercise, we need to understand that how we get better is actually a response to a stimuli, and the stimuli being the training. It is a stressor that is placed on the body, and then the body must respond to that, and it does so by adapting. And that is that repeated SRA, stimulus, response, adaptation. Okay, there's that continued cycle over and over again, which makes us better at whatever we're trying to achieve in training. Now, the initial response to the stressor is an important part of the adaptation that then follows. However, very high doses of vitamin C that we would only feasibly obtain through supplementation actually blunts that initial inflammatory response after a training stimulus has been applied. Now, the result of that is because the response is blunted, the adaptation is therefore going to be blunted too. So long term, if we were consistently supplementing with vitamin C, in short, we might be leaving quote unquote gains or training response outcomes or progress on the table. We might be selling ourselves short from, getting as jacked as we want sort of perspective, but again, it's not going to mean that you won't get jacked at all. It might just mean that you're just leaving some gains on the table. So really, it all comes back to this argument of, well, what would be the benefit of me taking vitamin C if I'm already eating enough through food, which is a very easy thing to do. And if you weren't eating enough through food, then, just some very basic dietary adjustments would allow you to achieve that. And to me, there is just not a very favorable risk versus reward ratio when you are considering the purpose and utility of vitamin C supplementation.
I see. Okay. Point. And now, there's another thing that's also been on the market lately. This might have been trending. Now, personally, for you and me, because we obviously live in Australia, obviously you're in Gold Coast, I'm in Perth. Rice Krispie treats aren't exactly something that are easy to get a hold of these days, but there's been a lot of there's been a lot of talk of going around lately. A lot of people taking these Rice Krispie bars before they have workouts. Have you heard about this trend going around?
Rice Krispie bars, not specifically, but are they something like LCMs?
Yes, correct.
Is there anything different about them?
That's the thing. I don't really know. I feel like they're similar to LCMs. They're not the chocolate ones. You get the white ones, pretty much.
Yeah.
I was just wondering because there's a lot of talk going around lately about having Rice Krispie treats for a workout. Apparently, it's supposed to help with the pump. Supposed to ease into it. Well, when I said to that, I said, well, maybe that might be the case because there's some sugars in it. You get those people that like to have some high GI jelly beans before they start a workout to get those blood sugar levels up, or they like to have a post-workout. Well, then there's a little bit of carbs as well in Rice Krispie treats. I'm just going to for someone who doesn't really know much about them, we don't really get it much here. I was just wondering if you heard anything about it.
No, I haven't. But what I will say is if they are somewhat similar to an LCM, which, they almost certainly would be, often you'll see on the labels oh, it's organic or it's natural. And then really when you think about it and look at what's in it, it probably isn't too much different than what it says on the tin, which is a Rice Krispie bar, which is basically an LCM of some description. So look, like a lot of things in nutrition, there's grains of truth behind pretty much everything that you hear. As dumb as it is, there's always almost always some little pinch of truth. Now, having high glycemic, let's take a backpedal here. Exercise or muscular contraction is quote unquote fueled by this thing called ATP, right? Now, we don't store very much ATP. So what we have to constantly do is regenerate it. Now, when we exercise, there's a really high demand for ATP because, we're doing a lot of stuff. We're moving quite strenuously and we're moving quickly or lifting a lot of things. Now, so we need to regenerate this ATP. We don't store much of it because we don't store much of it. Now, carbohydrates can keep up to a degree, obviously, with the demand for a very high demand for regeneration of ATP. So in short, carbohydrates are the main fuel of strenuous exercise. So prior to commencing, or as we commence exercise, we want to basically ensure that carbohydrates are abundantly available, because if they are slightly depleted, it may affect our ability to exercise. Now, we might still have heaps of carbohydrates in the quote unquote fuel tank, but it's a little bit different to a car, whereas a car will perform the same up until it's empty. When, the fuel tank of carbs starts to just drop below full, the body sort of starts to know that, and it may affect our ability to perform our absolute best. So what we want prior to an exercise session is to basically have our carbohydrate stores fully topped up, and probably a little bit of additional carbohydrates just getting into the bloodstream as we exercise, because we've consumed carbohydrates in the hours prior. Now, another consideration in exercise is actual comfort. And we need to be extra vigilant with this, because during exercise, our ability to digest food, or our gut's capacity to tolerate food, is impaired for numerous reasons, when the exercise is hard enough, of course. So we want to prioritize comfort. And the way we would achieve that is through quote unquote more processed, high carbohydrate, low fat and low fiber foods. Something like Rice Krispies really fits that bill. It's going to be low in fiber. It's going to be pretty low in fat. It's going to be very high in carbohydrates. And it's going to be easily digested, without causing or risking too much discomfort, like gut upset. And given the fact that it's low in fiber and fats, it's actually going to be digested and deposited into the bloodstream very, very quickly. Okay, so we can have them, 2 hours prior to exercise. And that's not just going to be sitting in our gut when we're training. If we had a massive bowl of oats, it's got heaps of fiber and we're chucking peanut butter in it, that's still going to be sitting in our guts when we exercise. And that's not really of much use. In fact, it's actually going to make us feel kind of heavy and full, and that's going to therefore affect our ability to perform our best. Now, the other thing with the Rice Krispies is that they probably, I would imagine, have a decent amount of sodium, or basically salt. And that can promote blood flow, potentially increase acute blood pressure. And this is probably where this hint of truth of, getting the pump lies. It may also positively affect hydration status, because when, of the fluid that we do consume, if we have electrolytes or sodium paired with that, we're going to basically, for lack of a better phrase, piss out less of it, so we retain more of it. And we know that being adequately hydrated is a good idea for performance. If we are slightly dehydrated, even 2%, we will see a performance detriment. So for these reasons, the Rice Krispie snacks are probably actually a really good idea to be consumed as a pre-exercise snack. However, their benefits are definitely not exclusive to the Rice Krispies, but rather any sort of low fiber, low fat, high carb, easily digestible snack, I suppose. And whether you would have a snack or a meal would sort of depend on when you had your last meal, how hungry you are, how much time you have between the meal and when you want to commence training, your individual preferences and tolerances. But generally speaking, due to their nature, snacks are probably going to be a little bit more easily and comfortable digested. So in terms of something that you would consume quite close to exercising, things like salted pretzels, Rice Krispie snacks, LCMs, like a Milo bar, for example. Another good one would be like even things like crumpets with a bunch of jam or honey on them are pretty good too. I feel like also the Pop-Tart trend is sort of the same boat. From memory, they're actually quite low in fats and, therefore probably actually a pretty good idea pre-exercise for those who have the calories to play with. If you are someone seeking a calorie conscious goal where you do need to be mindful of how you are spending your calories, you probably don't want to be sort of, for lack of a better phrase again, sort of pissing them away on calories that won't really fill you up or suppress your appetite very much. But if you have the calories to play with, Rice Krispies, those sort of things, great. But again, not exclusive to Rice Krispies, I would say, based on my assumption that they are like LCMs.
Cool, awesome. That makes more sense, because when you've listed those few pre-workout recommendations, there's always the typical people that always go for like the things like the rice cakes and honey. Those usually a go-to. The crumpets, definitely seen that come around. Personally, I am someone myself who did hop on that Pop-Tart trend. I didn't really, I felt like the sugar sometimes I found myself getting a little bit of a crash 30 minutes into the workout. Maybe the sugar was a little bit too much. Now, again, just to recap your argument just there, because we were talking about pre-workout meals, like what are some good guidelines, which you just mentioned earlier on, that a good pre-workout meal should have?
Yeah. So I love that question. I've done a lot on this and it's pretty much a topic that I'm very interested. But before I'll get into that, you mentioned the crash after the Pop-Tarts, 30 minutes into the workout. Yeah. Now there is this idea that you'll get this spike in blood sugar and then a subsequent crash after something that is quickly digested. So when we think quickly digested, it's going to get in the bloodstream real fast. Okay. So the fundamental difference between the carbs that you get in, say, broccoli and the carbs that you get in a Pop-Tart is that, I'm not talking about the nutrient side of things. I'm literally just talking about the carbohydrates, is that the carbohydrates in the Pop-Tart are going to get sucked in really quickly, whereas the carbohydrates in the broccoli, with all that fiber and everything, is going to take a long time because fiber slows down the rate of digestion. Now, some folks will say to you, you should include a little bit of fat in your pre-exercise meal to basically slow down that rise in blood sugar concentration. So, if you're having a Pop-Tart, it's going to get sucked in really fast, and then you're going to see a drop after, right? So then their argument is that, okay, well, if we add a little bit of fats, it's going to be more of a drip feed effect rather than just, it's getting sucked in really fast. So we won't get that crash. However, to my understanding, this is actually being tested and it hasn't been shown. There isn't, I believe, sufficient evidence to suggest that having something that is high glycemic or high GI, so those more sugary sort of style foods, prior to exercise will necessarily yield a crash due to some sort of quick spike and then quick fall after. To my understanding of what I've read, it doesn't work like that. Now, back to your other point about what do good pre-exercise snacks sort of have. So there are really 4 pillars of the pre-exercise window, or there's like a checklist that we would want to consider as we are coming into our exercise session. And for me, this is actually a fantastic example of me translating like really complicated nutrition stuff that I read into something that's actually understandable and like an understandable framework. I was reading all these textbooks and doing all these lectures in my postgraduate diploma 2 years ago when it was like, we're reading, in performance nutrition. And I'm thinking, you're making this so much more complicated than it needs to be. Like you could just sort of give people 4 main pillars to consider and give them some nuance and context around it, and they'd probably understand it.
So I was going to say, they could do that, but then they'll lose a whole bunch of money. So you were saying.
Yeah. So the 4 pillars are really the things that everyone should consider prior to exercise are comfort and hydration. That's even, my 60-year-old mum who goes and does her Pilates, like they're the things that she's going to think about. A level up from that, fuel availability. And what is fuel for exercise? Carbohydrates. Okay. So we've got our carbohydrates available in abundance. So these storage tanks in our liver, in our muscles, and a little bit of extra floating around the bloodstream, they're full. There's plenty of carbs around that we can play with. Okay. Now the final pillar is caffeine. Caffeine's a little bit more nuanced because not everyone deals with caffeine well. Some people, get really anxious about it, or they might need to run to the bathroom really quickly. In that case, I would actually consider, before just cutting caffeine, maybe looking at other sources of caffeine or adjusting the dose. Anyway, the other thing you want to think about, if it's late in the day, it's probably not worth sacrificing a night of sleep unless it's a really important competition where it would be worth it. But under normal training settings, the sports performance effect of consistent good sleep supersedes the effect of caffeine on performance, right? So if it's late in the day, don't have caffeine, is what I'm saying. But really, under other settings, caffeine, carbohydrates, comfort, and hydration. And these are the things that you want to consider as you are commencing an exercise session. These are the 4 pillars that you want to consider. Now, they sort of tie into one another. So the comfort pillar needs to be considered when you are choosing how you're going to nail your fuel pillar. So you need to think about what meals or snacks or ingredients that provide carbohydrates will protect comfort at the same time. Because again, if you just thought carbohydrates, you might go and have a massive bowl of oats with a bunch of, fruit and, a bunch of peanut butter and seeds and all these things in it, full of fiber, lots of fat. Before an exercise session, that could cause gut upset. So not satisfying the comfort pillar.
Keep going, sir. I'm just about to sneeze. Keep going.
Oh, good. So So really, it's a combination of what works for you, what you're confident will not cause discomfort for you, what you enjoy, as well as consideration for both how much carbohydrate you wish to consume, which is also underpinned by whether you are trying to restrict your calories for a fat loss purpose or whether you are not trying to do that, as well as the timing. So how much time do I have before my exercise session? If you have 4 hours, you could probably quote unquote, get away with more of a mixed meal because you've got more time to digest that. It's got more time to get past digestion and start drip feeding into the bloodstream. Any gut upset or sort of bloating that might occur might have time to subside a little bit after you eat that meal. Whereas if you only have an hour, your food selection to get those carbohydrates into the bloodstream is going to be vastly different. You don't have as much time to do it. So in those instances, you're going to want to really go low on the fat and the fiber because they're the things that are going to slow it down. But also, in addition to that, you also want to think about whether there's any ingredients in there that might actually trigger gut upset. And this could be things such as, certain synthetic fibers or certain sugar alcohols, which are both safe and helpful, but may actually cause gut upset in certain individuals in certain situations. So they're sort of the main things that you would want to think about when it comes to what you eat and drink in the hours prior to exercise.
Wow, fair point.
It's a lot to take in.
That is, especially on terms of like caffeine as well. But you kind of made it say that even though it's a pillar, would you argue that it's probably the weakest of the pillars? Or
caffeine?
Yeah,
definitely. It carries the lowest utility and I would say the greatest risk of adverse reaction. So look, it's sort of a thing like if the time of day is appropriate, if the situation is appropriate, if the individual tolerates caffeine well, if they are going to consume a dose and caffeine from a source that they are confident will not cause gut upset, then it's like the risk is lower and the reward is greater. Whereas, if you take someone who is training late in the day, they don't consume any caffeine, and all of a sudden you give them a scoop of Jack 3D or some shit.
The old school formula.
The risk of an adverse reaction is really, really high. Even if they don't react to it negatively, it could literally put them in this state of anxiety and nervousness. And if we were thinking about this in a competition setting, that could be really a bad thing. Because, if you were a powerlifter and all of a sudden you're just so jacked up on caffeine that you are just like a nervous Nelly, how do you think that's going to affect your ability to perform on the platform?
Obviously quite bored. The thing is, how I've always seen caffeine is the way I always open to, because I get asked a lot as personal trainer, do you reckon I should take pre-workout? I should take, should I drink more coffee before workouts? I've always seen it as a double-edged sword, because I say, well, look, it will help. It's got many studies on it and how much it helps, but at the same time, it can be very, very detrimental, because let's say, for example, let me give you two scenarios. You give me a scenario, I'll give you one guy who's you give them both the exact same amount of caffeine. So let's say one scoop of, with the C4 or, any certain contents really, anything with enough stimulants in it. You give them, here's the two scenarios. The first scenario is where they have, plenty of sleep, carbohydrate loaded, plenty of hydration. You give him a scoop of pre-workout, he's going to go smash that, probably going to go smash that pre-workout, versus someone who's completely lacking sleep, completely lacking hydration, completely lack in haven't eaten any food. You give them a scoop of caffeine, that's probably going to have a very, very detrimental effect. So that's just all the way I've seen it. So I've always told people, don't depend. It can assist you, but also don't create dependence. Now, also, there's one last question I sort of just wanted to ask you to finish this up real quick, because that's coming up to the end of our time. I've been having a lot of arguments lately about people and dry scooping pre-workouts. Now, for someone such as myself, pre-workout is awesome. I love it, and it's helped me definitely. I like, especially when you cycle in and off. You go through this caffeine withdrawals, but at the end of it, it's definitely worth it when you come off it, especially when you take a non-stimulant one. But there's these people who dry scoop pre-workout, you know, they shove a big scoop down there. I think it makes them look tough, shove a bit of water down there. I've seen some people argue for it. I've seen some people argue against it. What's your personal opinion to finish this up?
Yeah, so firstly, I'll say that you're really on the money with your whole spiel about caffeine being a double-edged sword and that we probably should be wary of developing a dependence on it. Now, speaking back towards your question then of the caffeine dry scooping thing, to be honest with you, I haven't looked into whether there are any sort of more specific pros or cons relating to whether you ingest it with fluid or whether you ingest it like dry scooping or whatever you want to call it. Potentially, one could just be that when you consume water, you're aiding hydration. There may be other things, you know, like the absorption of it or, the absorption of it, but I'm just not familiar with that. I can see, like, if I was to try and be as objective and as fair as possible about it, I would say that, you know, if it's more convenient for you to dry scoop your freaking pre-workout, like, go for it, as long as you are still hydrated. The one other thing I would say is it's probably an easier means to consume like massive doses of caffeine very easily, which is a consideration as well, especially if it's coming from pre-workout, which can have like, you know, 400 milligrams in like a serving at sometimes, which is just freaking through the roof of caffeine. The other thing I would say is that in terms of like this whole idea of cycling on or off, perhaps another approach could be like a maintenance dose, which is like your usual everyday dose, and that doesn't change. You never really cycle on and off. And for me, that's like one black coffee a day. That's something I do all the time. I've done it for years. Like, it doesn't change. And, you know, I don't feel a dependence on it, but also at the same time, like, you know, I feel like it just is that nice, happy middle road. It's that minimum effective dose. In some instances, I might be inclined to increase my dose when I need it. And perhaps that sort of approach is more desirable, where you have your baseline dose, but then the option to have, I guess, like a booster if the situation permits it. Now, for me, a situation would be like, well, I don't really train that hard. So, you know, I don't follow a program that does any of that. Like, if the surf was pumping, for example, and, you know, like, it gets really crowded here on the Gold Coast. A lot of the point breaks have like really big sweeps, which basically means that it can, like, surfing at some of these spots on a big day when there's a sweep is like a freaking marathon for 3 hours, because it's good. You're going to surf for several hours. So you need to be like ready. You need to have carbs abundant galore, caffeine city, you know, well hydrated, because you're about to go to war essentially. So in those instances, I might be like, right, I'm going to have more caffeine. Or if someone like an athlete of mine is, you know, a CrossFitter, for example, and they've got a CrossFit competition, they might go to their upper dose on those days when they are, you know, competing, because they want to perform their absolute best. Now, of course, this needs to be tested in prior periods. You know, you wouldn't just go increasing your dose willy-nilly. It'd be something, again, that you've actually tested out in training. You're confident in the sources of caffeine, or the combination of sources. You're confident in that dose that's going to do its job, you know, not be too much where you're really anxious, or, you know, not cause like you to get all like you got to go shit yourself or something like that. So like, really, it's sort of like, yeah, it's this idea of like, maybe adopt a, rather I'm going to cycle on or off, I'm just going to always start off with like that baseline dose, and that stays the same. There's no need to cycle on or off. It just stays the same. And then only on the days where I need, or like the weeks of training where, you know, I'm in like an overreaching period, or like it's a competition or something, and I really want to maximize things, they're the times where you might go like, okay, I'm going to go up a level.
Understood. So there's, safe to say, in short, you know, it's what benefit, as you say, it's more of like, you know, it can benefit you, it can benefit you, you know, depending, but the literature's still kind of out there, you know what I mean? Like, the jury's still out there, and whether it's better to dry scoop or, you know, just take it how it should be with water.
Yeah. Speaking to dry scooping more specifically, I would say that, well, firstly, I don't know if there's literature on it because I haven't looked for it. I can see like logical rationale behind why you wouldn't do it and why it would be better just to consume it as recommended. Mm-hmm. So of rationale, if I'm trying to be as objective and fair and like level-headed as possible, why for convenience reasons or even preference reasons, someone just said, oh, I can't be bothered mixing water, I'll just dry scoop it. I understand that. I can empathize with that. Whether it's, and the thing is, even if it might not be the best idea, for the benefits of convenience and feasibility, it might actually be worth it for some people.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Fair point. Oh, well, that's a good point to finish it on. First of all, just want to say thank you so much for coming back on, Mackenzie. It's always an honor to have you on. Honestly, man, you keep up the good work with what you're doing on social media, man, because I'm constantly following, I'm always reading, I'm always learning what you're doing. And honestly, I want to make sure we can leave this conversation a little bit open-ended, somewhere down the line, if you ever come across any information on, whenever it's better to dry scoop or whenever it's better to take a water, honestly, let me know and post it. And that's something, again, we can talk about in the future. I mean, other than that, man, just one last question before we let you go. Of course, I'm always saying, if my audience wants to find you and follow you, where can they?
Yeah, man. Thanks so much for having me on the podcast again. Like, really appreciate you asking some really good questions that are making me think a little bit here. So where can the listeners find me? So they can definitely find me on Instagram. It's at Mackenzie Baker, one word, Mackenzie, Baker, like baking a cake with an underscore at the end. I also work for a company called Fortitude Nutrition Coaching, also on Instagram as well as Facebook. And then on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, I have the Macabolic Podcast, and Fortitude Nutrition has the Team FNC podcast. Now, if you just want bite-sized chunks, like 3-minute episodes on a particular topic, the Team FNC podcast is definitely the one for you. Josh is really good at explaining things very succinctly, very concisely, in a very sort of simple way, and they are topics that people are actually interested in knowing. They're not like the long-form ones, whereas my own podcast is more like a conversation or a storytelling sort of thing with a guest and on the odd occasion by myself. So yeah, thanks again for taking the time to chat with me. I really appreciate it. And I hope the listeners got something else out of it. And I will actually put that on the list of things I could write content on, the dry scooping versus in the water pre-workout.
Awesome. Appreciate it, man. All right. Well, you take care of yourself, man. And I'll talk to you soon. Okay, buddy?
Thanks, buddy. Have a good one.
All the best. You too.
Gotcha.